Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Socratic program. Today, I'm going to show you how to solve this problem, which is reverse a linked list. So this problem is probably not going to come up on an interview, but it may help you understand better the concept of a linked list, because it really requires you to correctly reason about the structure of a linked list in order to be able to manipulate it. So basically, the problem statement is like this. So given the head of a singly linked list, reverse the list and return the reversed list. So on a linked list, as you know, probably you have a bunch of nodes, and each node references another node. So this node is referencing this other node, this node is referencing this other node, and so on. And you actually have the definition of a single linked list here on JavaScript. And you can see that it has a property which is the value held by the node. In this case, for example, that will be 1. And a next property, which is a pointer to the next node, which in this case is going to be 2, which in turn is pointing to 3, which in turn is pointing to 4, and so on. So what you need to do is to reverse this. So the number 1 is going to be at the end, the number 2 is going to be the penultimate number, and so on. So basically what you have to do is this. Let me show you first the reasoning at a higher level. So you can imagine that there is always a previous node, right? And a next node. So in the case of the number 1, the first node, you can imagine that there is a previous node which is going to be null, right? So now the number 1 is pointing to 2, but you want the number 1 to point to the previous node. So you make the swap. Then you go to the next node, which is going to be 2. And you want this node to point to the previous node, which is going to be 1. So 2 is now going to point to 1, which in turn is pointing to null. Then you go to the next node, and now this node, instead of pointing to 4, now it's going to be pointing to the previous node, which is going to be 2, which in turn points to 1, which in turn is pointing to null. So in the end, it's going to end up like this. So a purely reversed linked list. And in order to implement this, you have to do the following. First, we are going to declare 3 variables. As I already told you, there is always going to be a previous node, which we are going to initialize null. Then there is going to be a current node, which at first is just going to be the header. Then there's going to be a next node, which is going to be just null. And then we want to do a while loop. So we want to loop as long as there is a current node. If there isn't a current node, then that means that we've already iterated through all of the nodes. And then, as I told you before, we want to make a swap. Now the next node, instead of pointing to, for example, the number 2, is now going to be pointing to the previous node, which is going to be null. So the first thing that we want to do is that current, the next node is now going to be, previous node. So the current node is now going to point to the previous node, right? So this is the actual swap. This is the main logic. And this is fine. But now we want to do this with the next node, which is 2. So we need, before modifying this next property, we need to hold a pointer to this next node. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to save current next into our next variable. And now we want this next node to become the current node. So that we can repeat the process with the next node, which is now going to be 2. But I need to always hold a reference to the previous node. But if the current node is now 2, then the previous node is not null, it is 1. So I need to make the previous node point to 1. And 1 is just your current node at that moment, right? So at this stage, the current node is still the number 1. Okay, so that's basically it. But there is one thing that you need to know, and it is the following. You can't return the head. You can't do, you can return the current node. Because at the end of the iteration, this current node is going to be just null. Because next is going to be null. So in order to avoid that situation, what you really need to return here is previous node, which is going to be actually the reverse linked list, which is what we want. And just so that you can see that this actually works, I'm going to run it. You can see that these initial tests cases pass. And finally, I'm going to submit. And there you go.